The air in the subterranean vault of the iron market didn't just smell like damp earth and rot. It smelled like terror. It was a thick, cloying scent that stuck to the back of the throat, a mixture of old blood, rusted metal, and the pheromones of broken things. Down here, beneath the glittering skyscrapers of a city that pretended to be civilized, the world's most dangerous currency wasn't gold. It was life. Forbidden creatures, stolen lives, and ancient beings were sold to the highest bidder under the flicker of dying halogen lights. Welcome to the shadows, everyone. The narrator's voice carries a warm, intimate weight, cutting through the darkness of the scene. I am so glad you could join us for this journey today. Before we descend further into the secrets of the iron market, I want to say a huge hello to all of you watching. Whether you're tuning in from a quiet room in London, a bustling street in Lagos, or under the stars in Texas, wherever you are in the world, how are you doing today? I truly hope you're ready for a story that will pull at your heartstrings and keep you on the edge of your seat. If you haven't already, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support means the world to us, and we have so many more emotional stories waiting for you. Are you subscribed? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your stories as much as I love telling mine. In the center of the vault stood Ellen Hunt. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her worn leather jacket, not to keep them warm but to hide the way they were shaking. She shouldn't have been here. A woman like her, a woman who spent her days translating ancient, forgotten languages in the quiet corners of university libraries, had no business in the belly of a criminal beast. But Ellen had always been cursed with a heart that felt too much, a heart that heard the silent screams of the world and couldn't turn away. Her eyes swept across the cages. To her left, a shimmering sylph with clipped wings wept silently. To her right, something massive and scaled paced a cage too small for its bulk. But then she saw him. In the furthest, darkest corner of the auction floor, there was a cage that seemed to absorb the light around it. It wasn't made of iron. It was made of cold-forged obsidian, etched with glowing blue runes that hummed with a suppressive, agonizing frequency. Inside sat a wolf. He was massive, his fur the color of a winter midnight, matted with dried blood and grime. Heavy, silver-treated chains were bolted directly into the stone floor, pulling his neck down, binding his paws, and cinching around his torso until his ribs were visible with every shallow, pained breath. The other creatures were howling, scratching, or begging for a quick end. This wolf did neither. He was silent. He sat with a terrifying, unnatural stillness, his head bowed. "What is that?" Ellen whispered, her voice barely a thread. The auctioneer, a man with teeth sharpened to points and eyes that held no soul, let out a harsh laugh. That's a mistake. A stray we found in the northern waste. He's been through 3 handlers already. They tried to break him, to make him shift, to make him submissive. He just kills whoever enters the cage. We're selling him for scrap, really. Or for someone who wants a very dangerous rug. Ellen felt a sudden violent jolt in her chest. A physical pull like a hook catching under her ribs and yanking her toward the obsidian bars. She moved before she could think, her boots clicking on the blood-stained stone. As she approached, the wolf's ears flicked. Slowly, with a mechanical, agonizing effort, he raised his head. His eyes weren't the yellow or blue of a normal wolf. They were a burning, molten gold, swirling with a storm of suppressed fury and something else. Something ancient and devastatingly lonely. He didn't look at her like a beast looks at a predator or prey. He looked at her with a piercing, sapient intensity that stripped away her defenses, seeing right through her skin to the very vibration of her soul. "He's dying," Ellen breathed, her hand reaching out toward the bars. "He's a waste of credits, lady," the auctioneer spat. 5,000 and he's your problem. But we don't give refunds when he rips your throat out in the transport van." Ellen looked at the wolf again. Up close, she could see the silver chains burning into his skin, the faint wisps of smoke rising where the metal met his fur. He was in constant, agonizing torment, yet he didn't utter a single whimper. He just watched her. He looked at her as if he were waiting, not for freedom but for a witness to his end. "I'll take him," Ellen said, her voice snapping with a sudden, fierce authority she didn't know she possessed. She pulled out her digital wallet, dumping every cent of her life savings. The money meant for her research, for her rent, for her future. "Everything I have. Take it. Just give me the key to those chains." The auctioneer grinned, a jagged, hideous sight. "Suit yourself, sweetheart. You just bought yourself a death sentence. As the transaction cleared and the auctioneer handed her the heavy rune-etched key, a deathly silence fell over the vault. The other buyers backed away, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Ellen stepped toward the obsidian cage, the key cold in her hand. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the wolf, whose golden eyes were now fixed solely on the key. For a fleeting second, the air in the room felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked into a vacuum. A low vibrational hum began to emanate from the wolf's throat. Not a growl, but a sound that felt like the earth shifting deep underground. Ellen reached for the lock, her fingers trembling. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice cracking with an overflow of empathy. "I'm going to get you out of here. I promise." He slid the key into the lock. The blue runes on the cage flared into a blinding, angry violet. Was she saving a life, or was she about to end her own? As the heavy tumblers of the lock groaned and began to turn, Ellen realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the wolf wasn't just sitting still because he was weak. He was sitting still because he was concentrating. The lock clicked open. The chains fell away from the stone floor with a deafening crash. And in that moment, the silent, broken wolf didn't collapse. He stood up. The height of him kept going and going until he towered over her, his presence expanding until it filled the entire vault, suffocating the light. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient forest, and the gold in his eyes turned into a literal flame. Ellen took a step back, her breath hitching. What are you?" The wolf didn't answer with a bark. He didn't lung. Instead, he let out a sound that shook the very foundations of the building. A roar that sounded like a king reclaiming a throne. "I'm so glad you're enjoying the tension so far. Let's dive deeper into the hearts of our characters and uncover the secrets that led them to that fateful moment in the iron market." The silence that followed the wolf's roar was more terrifying than the sound itself. In the iron market, silence usually meant something had died. But this silence felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for a god to speak. Ellen stood frozen, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her collarbone. She had spent her life surrounded by the dead, ancient texts, dusty relics, and languages no one had spoken in 1,000 years. She was comfortable with the past because the past was safe. It couldn't bite back. But as the massive shadow of the wolf loomed over her, Ellen realized she had stepped out of the library and into a furnace. "Move. Get it back in the cage," the auctioneer screamed, his bravado replaced by a shrill, jagged terror. He lunged forward, brandishing an electric prod that crackled with blue sparks. Ellen didn't think. She stepped between the man and the beast. "No. He's mine. I bought him." The auctioneer didn't care. He swung the prod, aiming for the wolf's wounded flank. But the wolf was faster than a blink. A massive furred paw swiped through the air, shattering the reinforced plastic of the prod as if it were a dry twig. The man was sent flying backward, crashing into a stack of empty iron crates. The wolf turned his head back to Ellen. The golden fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed, but the predatory edge had softened into something resembling curiosity. He took a single heavy step toward her, his claws clicking like bone on the stone floor. Ellen didn't run. She couldn't. There was a tether between them now, forged in the moment she had looked into his eyes and seen a soul instead of a monster. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "They'll bring reinforcements. Please, follow me." To the shock of the remaining guards and the cowering bidders, the beast lowered his head. He didn't shift back into a human, not yet, but he moved with a limp that suggested he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. Ellen led him through the maze of the underground, her small frame a stark contrast to the hulking midnight black shadow following at her heels. Once they reached her battered, reinforced transport van on the surface, the cool night air hit them. Ellen scrambled into the driver's seat, and the wolf climbed into the back, his weight causing the entire vehicle to groan and tilt. As she sped away from the neon-lit district and toward the secluded outskirts of the city, she caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. He was watching the city lights fade with an expression of profound, regal disdain. Ellen Hunt was 26 years old, and until tonight her biggest risk had been a cup of coffee past midnight. She was the daughter of two world-renowned archaeologists who had vanished in the Carpathian Mountains when she was 12. She had grown up in foster care, clutching their old journals like talismans, teaching herself the dialects of the old world because she believed that if she could just translate the right passage she might find where they went. Her deepest fear wasn't death, it was irrelevance. It was the idea that she would live her whole life and never truly matter to anyone or anything. She was a ghost in her own life, a woman who lived through the stories of others. But as she looked at the bleeding, majestic creature in her back seat, she felt a spark of purpose so hot it burned. "I have a cabin," she said aloud, mostly to keep her own nerves from shattering. "It's off the grid. My parents bought it years ago. No one will look for you there." The wolf let out a low, rumbling huff. Sounded like agreement. They arrived at the cabin, a small stone and timber structure tucked deep within a forest of ancient oaks. The air here was cleaner, smelling of pine and damp moss. Ellen helped the wolf out of the van. He was stumbling now, the adrenaline of the escape wearing off, leaving only the jagged reality of his wounds. The silver-treated chains had left deep, caustic burns around his neck and wrists. Inside, Ellen moved with a clinical efficiency she didn't know she possessed. She lit a fire in the hearth, the orange glow dancing off the walls lined with books and maps. She brought out a bowl of warm water, clean linens, and a kit of medicinal herbs she had cultivated herself. "I need to clean the silver burns," she said, kneeling a safe distance away. "Silver is poison to your kind, isn't it? I read about it in the Codex of the Moon. It prevents the natural healing process. If I don't wash the residue out, the infection will kill you." The wolf watched her intently. He was sitting on a thick rug before the fire, his massive chest heaving. Slowly he extended his neck, exposing the raw, smoking flesh where the collar had been. It was an act of total, terrifying vulnerability. As Ellen worked, she spoke to him in the old tongue, the language of the first tribes. She didn't know if he understood the words, but the cadence was soothing, a song of healing and protection. "You aren't a mistake," she murmured, dabbing the cool water onto his wounds. "Whatever they told you, whoever put those chains on you, they were wrong." As the hours passed, she began to notice things that didn't fit the profile of a stray wolf. His fur, though matted, had the texture of silk. The way he carried his head even in pain was not that of a subordinate. And then there were the scars, not just from the market but older ones. Scars from blades, from arrows, from battles that must have lasted days. This wasn't just a wolf. This was a warrior. "Who did this to you?" she asked softly, her heart aching as she bandaged his forepaws. The wolf leaned forward, his wet nose brushing against her cheek. For a moment the world stopped. The heat from his body was like a furnace, and Ellen felt a rush of emotion so intense it brought tears to her eyes. It was a mixture of his pain and a sudden, fierce protectiveness. Suddenly the wolf's body began to convulse. A sickening sound of snapping bone filled the small cabin. Ellen scrambled back, gasping as the fur began to recede, the snout shortening, the massive frame shifting and shrinking, yet remaining powerful. Within seconds the wolf was gone. In his place lay a man. He was breathtaking. Even covered in grime and blood, he possessed a beauty that was jagged and dangerous. His hair was as black as the wolf's fur, falling over a brow that was etched with a permanent command. His shoulders were broad enough to carry the weight of a kingdom, and his skin was bronzed, crisscrossed with the silver-white lines of 100 battles. He groaned, his eyes snapping open. That same molten gold stared back at her, but now, housed in a human face, the intensity was almost unbearable. He tried to sit up, but his strength failed him and he slumped back against the rug. "Water," he rasped. His voice was like grinding stones, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. Ellen quickly brought a cup to his lips, supporting his head with her arm. He drank greedily, his throat working. When he finished, he looked up at her, his gaze sweeping over her simple clothes and her wide, worried eyes. "You speak the tongue of the elders," he said, his voice a low growl. "Why?" "I'm a translator," Ellen whispered. I've studied it my whole life." The man let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. "A translator. A human girl with a soft heart and old words. Do you have any idea what you've done, Ellen Hunt?" Her heart skipped a beat. "How do you know my name?" "I heard the auctioneer say it when he took your credits," the man said. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the edge of her sleeve. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a physical connection that made her breath hitch. "You bought a king for the price of a peasant's life. You have freed the sun in the middle of the night. I don't care about titles, Ellen said, her voice gaining strength. I just saw someone who was hurting. I saw someone who had given up. The man's eyes flashed. I had not given up. I was waiting for the moon to turn. I was waiting for my strength to return. But you accelerated the clock. He leaned back, his expression turning somber. My name is Caleb Vance. And you need to understand something, Ellen. The people who put me in that cage. They aren't just traffickers. They are traitors. And they will come for me. Which means they will come for you. Ellen looked around her quiet, peaceful cabin, the only home she had ever really known. She thought about the shadows of the iron market and the way the auctioneer had looked at her. Let them come, she said, surprised by her own defiance. I'm not letting them take you back. Caleb looked at her for a long time, a strange, unreadable emotion flickering in his golden eyes. You are a strange creature, little translator. Most would run from a wolf. Fewer would stay for the man. I've always preferred the monsters in books to the people in the real world, she replied with a small, tired smile. They're more honest about what they want. And what do I want? Caleb asked, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous silk. I think you want justice, Ellen said. And maybe a reason to trust again. As the fire burned low, Caleb fell into a deep, healing sleep. Ellen sat by his side, her hand resting near his. She knew her life was over, the quiet, safe life she had built. She was now a fugitive, a woman who had stolen a king. I hope you're all still with me, the narrator's voice returns, soft and conspiratorial. Things are starting to get very intense, aren't they? If you're enjoying the connection between Ellen and Caleb, let me know by leaving a red heart in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. You don't want to miss what happens when the traitors finally catch up to them. Are you ready for part 3? Let me know. Ellen watched the rise and fall of Caleb's chest, wondering who he really was. He had called himself a king, and the power rolling off him even in sleep suggested he wasn't lying. But as she looked at the way his hand twitched in his sleep, she didn't see a king. She saw the wolf she had saved. And she knew with a terrifying certainty that she would do it all over again. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. The crickets had stopped their rhythmic chirping, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ellen was jolted awake not by a sound but by the absence of one. She had been dozing in the armchair beside the hearth, her hand still inches away from Caleb's. Suddenly a hand, massive, hot and calloused, clapped over her mouth. Ellen's eyes snapped open, a scream dying in her throat. Caleb was hovering over her, his golden eyes glowing in the dying embers of the fire. He wasn't the broken man who had collapsed on her rug hours ago. He was a predator in high alert. He moved with a fluid, silent grace that defied his recent injuries, his muscles coiled like springs. Don't make a sound, he breathed into her ear. His voice was a vibration that traveled straight down her spine. They are here. Who? She whispered as he slowly pulled his hand away. The hounds of the usurper, Caleb said, his jaw tight. The ones who sold me to the market. They didn't think I'd be freed so soon. They expected me to rot until the lunar eclipse. Outside, the faint crunch of boots on dry leaves echoed. It wasn't just one or two men. It was a tactical unit. Through the slats of the window blinds, Ellen saw the sweep of high-intensity infrared beams cutting through the mist. These weren't street thugs from the underground. These were professional mercenaries armed with silver-tipped rounds and pulse rifles. I have to get you out of here, Caleb said, grabbing a heavy coat and throwing it around her shoulders. Me? Caleb, you're still healing. You can barely stand for long, Ellen protested, her heart hammering. I can stand long enough to tear their hearts out if they touch you, he growled. He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on her collection of ancient maps. There is a hidden path behind the waterfall at the Black Creek. If we can reach it, the iron deposits in the rock will mask my scent. Before they could move, the front door exploded inward. A flashbang grenade skittered across the floor, detonating in a blinding white light and a deafening roar. Ellen's world turned into a chaotic blur of ringing ears and stinging eyes. She felt Caleb's arm wrap around her waist, lifting her off her feet as he dove behind the heavy oak dining table. Clear the room, a voice barked, sharp, cold, and military. Ellen blinked through the haze to see 4 men in black tactical gear entering the cabin. They didn't look like humans. Their movements were too twitchy, their eyes reflecting the firelight like animals. They were beta shifters, the lower tier of Caleb's kind, turned into mindless mercenaries by the ones who had betrayed him. "Caleb Vance," the lead mercenary shouted, his voice distorted by a mask. "The High Council doesn't want you dead yet. Give us the girl and we might let you shift before we put the chains back on." Caleb rose from behind the table. He didn't shift into a wolf, not yet, but his shadow on the wall grew monstrous. His presence expanded, the air in the cabin vibrating with the sheer weight of his alpha authority. "You come into this house, the house of the woman who saved me, and you make demands?" Caleb's voice was no longer human. It was a tectonic shift. "You have forgotten who I am. You have forgotten why the stars bow when the king speaks." The mercenaries didn't wait. They fired. The room erupted in the staccato rhythm of gunfire. But Caleb moved like a streak of midnight. He flipped the heavy table with one hand to shield Ellen, then lunged. It was a blur of violence, primal, efficient, and terrifying. He didn't use a weapon, he was the weapon. He tore through the mercenaries with a speed that left Ellen gasping. But there were too many. A fifth man appeared at the broken window, aiming a specialized crossbow. "Caleb, watch out!" Ellen screamed. She didn't think. She grabbed a heavy bronze bust of an ancient philosopher from her desk and hurled it with every ounce of her strength. It struck the marksman's arm just as he fired. The silver bolt hissed through the air, grazing Caleb's shoulder instead of his heart. Caleb let out a guttural snarl, spinning around and launching himself at the window. The sounds of the struggle outside were brief and brutal, ending in a sickening silence. A moment later, Caleb stepped back into the cabin through the ruined doorway. He was drenched in blood, most of it wasn't his, and his eyes were pure molten gold. He looked at Ellen and for a heartbeat she saw the beast she had bought. He looked wild, untamed, and capable of ending the world. Then he blinked and the humanity returned, though it was frayed at the edges. He looked at the bronze bust on the floor, then at her. "You saved me," he said, sounding genuinely stunned. "Again." "I told you," Ellen said, her voice trembling as she stood up. "I'm not letting them take you back." But the victory was short-lived. From the forest, a low, haunting howl rose, a sound that made the very marrow in Ellen's bones ache. It wasn't the howl of a wolf. It was a call to war. "That's Julian Thorne," Caleb whispered, his face turning pale beneath the blood. "My second in command. The man who led the coup. He's here." "We can't win this here," Ellen said, grabbing her backpack filled with her parents' journals and the translation of the codex. "The van is out back." "The van is a metal coffin against Thorne," Caleb said. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and desperate. "We run. Into the deep woods. It's the only way." As they bolted out the back door and into the freezing night, Ellen looked back at her cabin. It was burning. The mercenaries had set it ablaze to flush them out. Everything she owned, her research, her memories, it was all going up in smoke. "Don't look back, Ellen," Caleb commanded, pulling her into the thicket as the shadows of giant wolves began to emerge from the tree-line. "From this moment on, your life belongs to the king. And I swear on my blood I will make them pay for every tear you shed today." They plunged into the darkness, the sounds of the hunt closing in behind them. Ellen realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that she wasn't just a translator anymore. She was the only thing standing between a fallen king and the end of his lineage. "I hope you're all breathing as hard as I am," the narrator's voice cuts in, tight with excitement. "The stakes just went through the roof. Ellen has lost everything to save Caleb. What would you do in her shoes? Leave a comment below with the word, run, if you think they'll make it. And if you're enjoying this heart-pounding journey, make sure you've hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next part of this epic saga. As they reached the edge of a steep ravine, Caleb stopped. He looked at the rushing water below, then at the glowing eyes circling them in the dark. "Can you swim?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Not well," Ellen cried. "Trust me," he said, pulling her close to his chest. The heat of him was the only thing keeping her from freezing. "Just don't let go." And then they jumped. The icy water hit them like 1,000 needles, a violent shock that threatened to steal the very breath from Ellen's lungs. The current of the Black Creek was a churning, angry beast, tossing them against submerged rocks and pulling them into the lightless depths. But through the chaos, Caleb's arm remained a literal lifeline, anchored around her waist with a strength that felt more like iron than flesh. When they finally broke the surface, gasping for air, they were miles downstream, shielded by the thick canopy of the forbidden reach. Caleb hauled Ellen onto a muddy bank, his movements labored. The silver bolt that had grazed his shoulder was taking its toll. The wound glowed with a sickly, pulsating violet light, a sign of the supernatural poison working through his system. "We have to move," Caleb rasped, his skin turning a ghostly gray. "The iron in these hills will hide us for a while, but Julian won't stop. He's a tracker by blood. He can smell fear from 3 leagues away." Ellen scrambled to her feet, her clothes heavy and freezing. She looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and saw the cracks in his kingly armor. He wasn't just a powerful alpha. He was a man who had been betrayed by his closest friend, stripped of his crown and hunted like an animal. "You can't walk like that," Ellen said, her voice firm despite her chattering teeth. She reached into her waterlogged bag and pulled out a small, sealed vial of translucent liquid, an extract of Lunigrazia, a rare herb her father had catalogued years ago. "Sit. Now." Caleb started to argue, but the look in Ellen's eyes, a fierce, maternal determination, silenced him. He slumped against a moss-covered boulder, watching her as she carefully cleaned the silver-poisoned wound. "You're a translator," he whispered, his golden eyes drifting shut as she applied the salve. "Where did you learn to heal a king?" "My father always said that words can heal a soul, but herbs heal the vessel," Ellen murmured. "He taught me that every poison has an antidote if you're brave enough to look for it." As the medicine began to work, drawing out the black veins of silver, the tension between them shifted. It was no longer just the urgency of flight. It was a growing magnetic attraction. Caleb reached out, his fingers brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. His touch was no longer the desperate grab of a drowning man. It was a lingering, reverent caress. "Why did you stay, Ellen?" he asked softly. "You could have left the key and run. You could have saved yourself 1,000 times tonight." Ellen looked down at her hands, stained with his blood and the earth of the forest. "Because when I looked at you in that cage, I didn't see a monster. I saw someone who was holding the world on his shoulders while the world tried to crush him. I've spent my life looking at the past, Caleb. For the first time, you made me want to see the future." The moment was interrupted by a low, vibrating hum, not from the woods but from the bag Ellen carried. She pulled out a small, ancient compass-like device, the lumen tracing. It was glowing a frantic, jagged red. "The tracing, it's picking up high-frequency shifts," she breathed, her eyes widening. "They aren't just tracking us by scent. They're using seeker stones. Julian is using forbidden magic to find you." "Then we have no choice," Caleb said, his strength returning as the poison receded. "We head for the high peaks. There's an old sanctuary there, a place of my ancestors. If I can reach the altar of the first king, I can reclaim the bond with my pack. I can call to the ones who are still loyal." "But the peaks are guarded by the shadow stalkers," Ellen reminded him, referencing the legends she'd translated. "No human has ever survived the ascent." "You aren't just a human anymore, Ellen," Caleb said, standing tall, his golden eyes blazing with a renewed light. "You are the one who freed the king. The mountains will know your heart." As they began the grueling climb, the environment itself seemed to turn against them. The air grew thin and biting, and the shadows between the trees seemed to detach themselves and follow. Every snap of a twig felt like a gunshot. To keep their spirits up, they spoke in hushed tones, Caleb telling her of the kingdom he had lost, a place of starlit valleys and ancient laws, and Ellen sharing the secrets of the text she had spent a lifetime decoding. They were building a bridge between 2 worlds, brick by emotional brick. Caleb found himself captivated by her intellect, the way her mind worked like a master key, unlocking mysteries he had lived with his entire life but never understood. And Ellen found herself falling for the man behind the crown, a man who loved his people so much he had allowed himself to be captured rather than let a civil war destroy his lands. "I have a question for all of you watching," the narrator's voice weaves back in, hushed and intense. "Do you believe in fate? Or do you think Ellen and Caleb were just 2 souls caught in the same storm? I want to see your thoughts in the comments. Type fate or chance. And if you're holding your breath for them, make sure to subscribe so you're here for the moment everything changes." The rising tension reached a fever pitch when they reached the Bridge of Whispers, a narrow stone arch over a bottomless chasm. Halfway across, the air suddenly curdled. A tall, elegant figure stepped out of the mist on the far side. He wore a high-collared coat of charcoal gray, and his eyes were a cold, piercing violet. "Julian," Caleb growled, stepping in front of Ellen. "Caleb," Julian Thorne replied, his voice a smooth, oily caress. "You always did have a penchant for the dramatic. And who is this? A little human pet to keep you warm in your exile." "She is more of a queen than you will ever be a king, Julian," Caleb snapped, his claws beginning to extend. "Is she?" Julian smiled, a hollow, terrifying sight. "Let's see how she fares when the truth comes out. Did you tell her, Caleb? Did you tell her why your own people stood by and watched while we put you in that cage?" Ellen felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She looked at Caleb's back, seeing the way his shoulders tensed. There was a secret here. A red herring Julian was dangling like a lure. "Don't listen to him, Ellen," Caleb shouted. But before another word could be said, Julian raised a hand, and the stone bridge beneath their feet began to groan and crack. "The ascent ends here," Julian declared. "Choose, Caleb. The crown or the girl." The bridge groaned, a sound like a dying giant as cracks spiderwebbed through the ancient stone. Dust and pebbles cascaded into the abyss below, disappearing into a fog that seemed to have no bottom. Caleb didn't hesitate. As the arch began to crumble, he lunged backward, catching Ellen's waist and throwing her toward the solid ground they had just left. He followed a split second later, his boots skidding on the precipice just as the center of the bridge vanished into the void. Julian stood on the opposite side of the chasm, looking down at them with a pitying smirk. "Still the hero, Caleb. Even when it costs you everything." "You know nothing of cost, Julian," Caleb roared, his voice echoing off the mountain peaks. "I know that your loyal subjects didn't fight back because they thought you were a curse," Julian shouted back over the roar of the wind. "Tell her, Caleb. Tell your little translator about the blood moon prophecy. Tell her why the king was destined to be the end of his own race." Julian turned and vanished into the mist, his cold laughter lingering in the air. Silence fell over the ridge, broken only by the whistling wind. Ellen stood up, brushing the grit from her knees, her heart feeling like a lead weight. She looked at Caleb. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He stood with his back to her, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles were white. "Caleb," she whispered. "What was he talking about?" He stayed silent for a long time. When he finally turned, the molten gold of his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, aching amber. "There is a prophecy written in the stars long before my grandfather took the throne. It says that an Alpha King would be born with a power so absolute, so untamed, that he would eventually lose his mind to the beast. That he would slaughter his own pack in a fit of lunar madness." Ellen's breath hitched. "And they think that's you?" "I am the strongest Alpha in 500 years, Ellen," he said, his voice cracking. "When the coup happened, my people didn't stay silent because they loved Julian. They stayed silent because they were afraid of me. They thought that by putting me in that cage they were saving themselves from a monster." He stepped toward her, his expression raw. "Julian didn't just betray me. He convinced my world that I was a ticking time bomb. Even now, as the eclipse approaches, I can feel it. A hunger, a darkness at the edges of my mind. Maybe the cage was where I belonged." Ellen felt a surge of indignation so hot it made her head spin. She walked right up to him, grabbing the lapels of his torn shirt. "Look at me, Caleb Vance. You are the man who sat in a cage of obsidian and didn't make a sound because you wouldn't give them the satisfaction of your pain. You are the man who shielded me from gunfire when you could have shifted and run. Prophecies are just stories written by people too afraid to shape their own destiny." "Ellen, you don't understand." "I understand languages," she shouted. "I understand that Alpha means first, not destroyer. If you were going to lose your mind, you would have done it in that market. But you didn't. You waited. You showed more restraint than any human I've ever met." The vulnerability in the air was thick enough to touch. In the shadow of the broken bridge, surrounded by enemies and ancient curses, Caleb reached out and cupped her face. His hands were shaking. For the first time, he wasn't a king or a wolf. He was just Caleb. "You see things no one else sees," he breathed. "Then see what I see," she replied. He leaned down, and when his lips met hers, it wasn't the soft kiss of a fairy tale. It was a collision. It was desperate, fierce, and filled with the fire of two people who had found their only anchor in a storm. The world around them faded, the cold, the height, the danger. For that moment, there was only the heat of his body and the taste of hope. But as they pulled apart, the sky above them began to darken. Not from a cloud, but from the creeping shadow of the moon. The eclipse, Caleb whispered, his grip on her tightening as a shudder racked his frame. It's starting. The shadow is falling. We're almost at the altar, Ellen said, pointing toward the shimmering white stone peak just above them. If the prophecy is a lie, we prove it there. We show them that the king is in control. Suddenly, the ground beneath them didn't just shake, it groaned. From the shadows of the trees emerged not wolves, but shadows given form, the shadow stalkers. They were the ancient guardians of the peak, and they didn't care about prophecies. They only cared about blood. Stay behind me, Caleb commanded, but this time his voice had a frightening edge to it. A dark purple aura began to bleed from his skin, clashing with the gold of his eyes. The revelation hit Ellen like a physical blow. Julian hadn't just been lying. He had used the Seeker Stones to infect Caleb's aura, accelerating the very madness the prophecy warned about. I love seeing your theories in the comments. The narrator's voice whispers, low and urgent. Is Caleb's destiny fixed in stone, or can Ellen's love rewrite the stars? If you believe in the power of the heart, type King in the comments right now. And don't forget to subscribe. We are heading into the darkest hour and I need you all with me. Caleb let out a low, pained growl, his muscles bulging as he fought to keep the beast at bay. Run, Ellen, he gasped. The altar. Get to the altar. If I can't follow, save yourself. I'm not leaving you, she screamed as the first shadow stalker lunged. Caleb, the altar. We have to reach the summit. Ellen cried out, but her voice felt small against the rising howl of a supernatural wind. Caleb didn't answer. He was bent double, his hands clawing at the frozen earth. The purple miasma Julian had planted in his soul was no longer a flicker. It was a wildfire. His spine cracked with the sound of breaking timber, his clothes tearing as his body fought a war against itself. The eclipse was nearing totality, the sun a dying sliver in the sky, and with every second of encroaching darkness, Caleb's humanity was being swallowed. Get away. He choked out, his voice now a terrifying layering of human grit and monstrous vibration. Ellen, I can't see you anymore. All I see is red. No. Ellen rushed to him, ignoring the shadow stalkers that nipped at her heels. She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. Look at me, Caleb. You are not a curse. You are the man who saved me. But as she looked into his eyes, her blood ran cold. The molten gold was gone. His pupils had expanded into bottomless voids of obsidian, reflecting the eclipsed sun. He let out a sound that wasn't a roar or a growl, but a scream of pure, agonizing madness. With a violent shove, he flung her away. Ellen tumbled across the jagged rocks, her shoulder slamming into a stone pillar with a sickening pop. She gasped, the world spinning in shades of gray and black. Through the haze she saw him. Caleb had fully shifted, but he wasn't the majestic midnight wolf she had freed. He was something distorted, larger, more jagged, his fur standing up like needles, his presence radiating a coldness that killed the grass beneath his paws. He turned on the shadow stalkers, but he wasn't defending the path anymore. He was a whirlwind of mindless destruction. He tore through the shadows, but then he turned his sight toward the only living thing left on the ridge. Ellen. He began to stalk toward her, his head low, a low demonic thrum vibrating in his chest. He didn't recognize her. To the beast she was just prey. Caleb, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. She tried to crawl back, but her injured shoulder failed her. She was trapped against the precipice. Just as the beast prepared to lunge, a shimmering violet barrier slammed down between them. I told you she was just a pet, Caleb. Julian's voice drifted from the shadows above. He was standing on a ledge, holding a glowing seeker stone that pulsed in sync with the eclipse. And now you'll be the one to end her. What a poetic finale for the great king. The prophecy fulfilled by your own teeth. Julian waved his hand and the barrier shifted, pushing Ellen closer to the edge of the cliff. Below her lay a 1,000-foot drop into the jagged rocks of the Forbidden Reach. Everything is falling apart. The narrator's voice is heavy with sorrow, almost a whisper. The man she loves has become the monster everyone feared, and her enemy is holding the strings. This is the moment where hope goes to die. Have you ever felt like the world was closing in on you? Like no matter how hard you fought, the darkness was winning? If you're crying with Ellen right now, type, "Hold on" in the comments. Let's send her our strength. And please, if you haven't subscribed, do it now. We can't leave her here alone. Ellen looked at the monstrous wolf that used to be Caleb. He was inches away now, his hot, rancid breath hitting her face. He snapped his jaws, a hair's breadth from her throat. "Caleb," she choked out, tears finally spilling over. "If this is the end, I don't regret it. I'd buy you again. I'd free you 1,000 times over." She closed her eyes, waiting for the final strike. She felt his teeth graze her skin, the cold, sharp reality of death. But the strike didn't come. Instead, she felt something warm. Something wet. She opened her eyes to see the monstrous wolf frozen. A single tear, golden and glowing, fell from his obsidian eye and landed on her cheek. Deep within that black void, a spark of gold flickered. He was fighting. Somewhere inside that mountain of corrupted muscle, Caleb was screaming, holding back the beast with the last threads of his soul. "Kill her!" Julian shrieked from above, his composure breaking. "Fulfill the prophecy, you coward." Caleb's body went rigid. He let out a mournful howl that sounded like a heart breaking in two. With a sudden violent twist of his head, he turned away from Ellen and leaped, not at her but at the ledge where Julian stood. "No!" Julian cried, firing a burst of purple energy. The two figures collided in mid-air, a tangle of man and monster, and disappeared over the far side of the summit. Ellen scrambled to the edge, screaming his name, but all she saw was the swirling mist and the deepening shadow of the total eclipse. The world went completely dark. She was alone on the mountain, her protector gone, her heart shattered, and the silence of the void ringing in her ears. She slumped against the altar of the first king, the cold stone the only thing keeping her upright. She had lost. The king was gone and the darkness had won. The darkness of the total eclipse wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight, pressing down on Ellen's chest until she could barely draw air. She sat huddled against the base of the altar, her fingers tracing the ancient frozen runes of the first king. The silence was absolute, a heavy shroud that whispered of failure and death. "Is this how it ends?" Ellen whispered to the shadows. "After everything? Just another forgotten story in the dirt." She looked at her satchel lying discarded a few feet away. One of her father's journals had fallen open, its yellowed pages fluttering in the frigid wind. Through the dim, eerie glow of the eclipse's corona, a single passage caught her eye. It wasn't a translation of a myth. It was a note her father had scribbled in the margin. "The stars do not dictate the path, they only provide the light. The heart is the true architect of the destiny." Ellen's hand went to the altar. She realized then that the runes weren't humming with power because of the eclipse. They were humming in response to her. The blood from her scraped palms had smeared across the white stone, and where it touched the ancient etchings they began to glow, not with Julian's sickly purple but with a pure, radiant silver. She wasn't just a translator. She was the witness. She was the one who had seen the man within the beast when the rest of the world saw a curse. "Caleb," she screamed, her voice cracking the silence. "I am still here. I am the one who holds the key." Far below, in the jagged ravine where the mist swirled like ghosts, a flicker of gold appeared. Caleb wasn't dead. He was pinned beneath the wreckage of a stone outcrop, his body broken and his mind still drowning in the purple haze. Julian Thorne lay a few yards away, groaning, his seeker stone cracked but still pulsing, trying to re-establish the link to Caleb's soul to finish the corruption. But the sound of Ellen's voice did something the prophecy never accounted for. It acted as a beacon, a frequency of pure, untainted love that sliced through the magical interference. Inside the darkness of his mind, Caleb saw her. Not as a victim but as a queen. He saw her standing at the altar, her hands glowing with the light of the first kings. The bond they had forged in the cabin, the vulnerability they had shared, became a tether. With a roar that shook the very roots of the mountain, Caleb pushed the stones off his body. The purple veins on his skin began to shrivel and turn to ash. The lunar madness wasn't a biological certainty. It was a spiritual vacuum that Julian had exploited. And Ellen had just filled that vacuum with her light. "He's coming back," the narrator's voice returns, now vibrating with a triumphant energy. Can you feel it? The shift in the wind? The darkness is breaking. Caleb is fighting his way back to the woman who never gave up on him. If you believe that love can break any curse, I want you to flood the comments with "Rise. Let the world hear us." And hit that subscribe button right now. We are heading into the final battle and the king is reclaiming his throne. At the summit, Julian scrambled up the rocks, his face a mask of desperation and fury. He clutched the broken seeker stone, aiming it at Ellen. "You've ruined everything. If I can't have the crown, I'll burn this mountain to the ground with you on it." He lunged at her, his hands shifting into claws. But Ellen didn't flinch. She stood her ground at the altar, her hands flat against the silver-glowing stone. "You aren't a leader, Julian," she said, her voice echoing with an authority that wasn't hers alone. "You're just a shadow. And shadows can't survive the dawn." A massive, midnight black shadow leaped over the edge of the cliff. Caleb had returned. He wasn't the distorted monster of the darkest hour, nor was he the broken wolf of the cage. He was something new, an alpha king who had survived the madness and come out stronger. His fur shimmered with the silver light of the altar, and his eyes were no longer obsidian. They were suns. He landed between Ellen and Julian, his presence so massive it seemed to push the very clouds away. He didn't growl. He didn't snarl. He simply looked at Julian with a terrifying, calm judgment. "The eclipse is over, Julian," Caleb said, his voice human and resonant once more. "The sun is returning. And you are out of time." The first sliver of the sun emerged from behind the moon, and a beam of pure light hit the altar, reflecting off the silver runes and bathing the summit in a blinding radiance. The turning point had arrived. The prophecy hadn't been about the end of a race. It was about the birth of a king who could master the dark. And as Caleb reached out a human hand to Ellen, she knew the final confrontation wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. Julian Thorne backed away, his heels skidding on the very edge of the precipice. The broken seeker stone in his hand hissed, leaking a foul, black smoke that smelled of sulfur and desperation. "This isn't possible," he screamed, his voice cracking like dry glass. "The prophecy, the blood, you were supposed to be the end, Caleb. You were supposed to tear her apart." Caleb stepped forward, each footfall resonating with the weight of a mountain. He was back in his human form, but he was draped in an aura of silver light that made him look 10 feet tall. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a fall. He looked like a god who had just walked out of a forge. "The prophecy was a warning, Julian," Caleb said, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum. "It was a warning to those who would try to rule through fear. It said the king would become a beast if he had nothing to hold on to. But you forgot one thing." He reached back, his fingers locking firmly with Ellen's. "I am no longer alone." With a shriek of rage, Julian crushed the seeker stone in his palm, absorbing the last of its corrupted magic. His body distorted, his limbs lengthening into a jagged, asymmetrical monstrosity. A shadow wolf that looked like a nightmare stitched together with spite. He lunged, a streak of violet and black aimed directly at Caleb's throat. But Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't even shift. He raised his hand and the silver light from the altar surged through him, forming a shimmering blade of pure alpha energy. The collision was deafening. The shockwave shattered the remaining stone pillars around the summit, sending a cloud of white dust into the air. Through the haze, Ellen saw the struggle, a battle not just of strength but of wills. Julian was the embodiment of every lie, every betrayal, and every chain that had ever bound Caleb. "You think they'll follow you?" Julian's distorted voice hissed as they grappled. "They saw you in that cage. They saw you broken. They will follow the man who broke the cage," Caleb roared. With a surge of power that seemed to draw from the very earth itself, Caleb drove his palm into Julian's chest. The silver light flared with the intensity of a dying star. It didn't just strike Julian, it purified him. The darkness was burned away, the shadow wolf form dissolving into ash until only a trembling, human Julian remained, pinned to the ground by Caleb's boot. Down in the valley the howls began. But they weren't the howls of hunters. They were the long, melodic cries of the pack, the true wolves who had felt the shift in the spiritual tide. They were coming not to kill but to kneel. Suddenly the air behind them shifted. The remaining mercenaries and the hounds that had followed Julian emerged from the tree line, their weapons raised. They saw their leader defeated, but they were still fueled by the momentum of the coup. "Kill them both," the mercenary captain shouted. "The king is weak. Look at him." Ellen stepped forward, her hand reaching into her satchel. She pulled out the Codex of the Moon, the ancient text she had spent her life translating. She didn't need to read the words anymore. She knew them in her soul. "By the laws of the first tribes." Ellen's voice rang out, amplified by the altar's resonance. "The king has faced the shadow and returned. The witness has spoken. Any who raise a hand against the sun shall be cast into the void." She slammed the book onto the altar. The silver light erupted in a massive dome, a pulse of energy that traveled down the mountainside like a tidal wave. The mercenaries' weapons disintegrated into dust in their hands. The beta shifters fell to their knees, the mental chains Julian had placed on them snapping like brittle thread. "This is the moment we've all been waiting for." The narrator's voice is jubilant, soaring above the sound of the wind. "The victory of the heart over the sword. The king has reclaimed his power, and the witness has claimed her place by his side. Can you feel the triumph? I want to see victory in the comments right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing the most beautiful ending in our channel's history. Join us for the final resolution." Caleb looked down at Julian, who was weeping in the dirt. "I won't kill you, Julian. Death is too kind for a man who tried to steal a soul. You will live to see the kingdom you tried to destroy flourish under a new light. Guards, take him." The loyalists, led by a scarred elder wolf who had been hiding in the shadows, stepped forward and hauled Julian away in heavy, cold iron, the same chains he had once used on his king. Caleb turned to Ellen. The silver glow was fading, leaving only the warmth of the morning sun. He looked at her bruised shoulder, her messy hair, and her eyes that still held the light of 1,000 stars. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to her, picked her up and held her as if she were the only solid thing in a shifting world. "You did it," she whispered into his chest. "We did it," he corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save my life, Ellen. You saved my soul." The battle was over. The mystery was solved. The Alpha King was no longer a captive, and the woman who bought him had found a wealth that no currency in the iron market could ever match. The mountain summit, once a theater of shadows and blood, was now bathed in the gold of a new dawn. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the faint, sweet scent of ozone that lingered after the altar's discharge. As the sun climbed higher, it felt as though the very earth was exhaling, shedding the weight of the usurper's reign. 3 months later, the world looked very different for Ellen Hunt. She stood on the balcony of the Sky Palace, a structure carved directly into the living white stone of the high peaks. Below her, the great forest stretched out like a sea of emerald, and for the first time in centuries, the wolves and the people of the valley lived without the shadow of the prophecy hanging over their heads. Ellen wasn't wearing her worn leather jacket anymore. Instead, she wore a gown of deep midnight blue, embroidered with silver threads that mimicked the constellations. But in her hand she still clutched a pen and a stack of parchment. She was no longer just a translator of the dead. She was the chronicler of the living, the woman who was rewriting the laws of the kingdom to ensure that no wolf, and no human, would ever be treated as a stray again. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist, and the familiar, intoxicating heat of Caleb's presence settled behind her. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his golden eyes scanning the horizon with a peace that had once seemed impossible. "You're working too hard again," Caleb murmured, his voice a low, affectionate rumble. "I'm just finishing the new treaty for the Southern Pax," Ellen replied, leaning back into him. "They need to know that the king's justice is a shield, not a sword." Caleb turned her in his arms, his expression turning serious yet tender. He reached into the collar of his tunic and pulled out a small, heavy object on a silver chain. It was the key to his obsidian cage, the one Ellen had used to free him. He had it dipped in gold and engraved with her name in the elder tongue. "You gave me my life back, Ellen," he said softly. "But more than that, you gave me a reason to love the world I was born to protect. Every day I wake up and see you, I know that the prophecy was wrong. I wasn't destined to be the end of my race. I was destined to find the one person who could help me lead them into a new beginning. I didn't do it because of destiny, Caleb," Ellen said, reaching up to brush a lock of dark hair from his brow. "I did it because I saw a man who was lonely. And I knew exactly how that felt. The romantic resolution wasn't just a political alliance. It was a soul-deep connection that had been earned in the trenches of the iron market and on the frozen slopes of the mountain. That evening, as the first stars began to twinkle, the entire pack gathered in the courtyard below. They didn't howl in fear or war. They sang a song of welcome. The chained wolf was a legend now, a story told to pups to teach them about the power of mercy. And the human girl was no longer a stranger to the supernatural world. She was its heart. This brings us to the end of our journey. The narrator's voice returns one last time, warm and filled with a sense of fulfillment. From a dark auction block to the heights of a kingdom, Ellen and Caleb proved that no chain is stronger than a heart that refuses to give up. I want to thank every single one of you for staying with us through all 9 parts of this emotional odyssey. Your support, your comments, and your energy have been the fuel for this story. Before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it the first kiss at the bridge, or the moment the altar turned silver? I'll be reading every single one. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We have so many more stories to tell, and I want you there for every single one of them. Until next time, remember, your light is stronger than any shadow. Stay blessed. As the moon rose, full, bright, and silver, Caleb and Ellen stood at the edge of the balcony. Caleb didn't shift into his wolf form to run tonight. Instead, he stayed as a man holding the hand of the woman he loved. They looked out at the future, a vast and unwritten map. There would be challenges and there would be more battles to face as they integrated their 2 worlds. But as long as they had the key and the heart, they knew they would never be lost again. The chains were gone. The king was home. And the girl who had spent her life looking for stories had finally found her own. Please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. It helps me keep bringing these epic high-stakes stories to life for you. Thank you so much for being part of the community.